Okay. Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar, Engaging Your Community Virtually, Harnessing Online and Socially Distanced Tools in the Time of COVID. My name is Kate Bohr, and I work for the Vermont Urban and Community Forestry Program, which is a collaboration between UVM Extension and Vermont Department of Forest Parks and Recreation. Today's webinar is our second, actually, in our Town Forest webinar series. These webinars are part of a broader project called Community Forests as Models of Stewardship. And so this initiative is actually designed to help highlight the roles of community forests as models of stewardship. In addition to these in addition to these webinars, we expect to be launching some new cool and exciting resources in the coming months. And so I'll be in touch with more details about those. So please stay tuned. This initiative is a collaboration among UVM Extension, Vermont Land Trust, the Northern Forest Center, Vermont Coverts, and Vermont Department of Forest Parks and Recreation. And so I just want to acknowledge the partnership and the collaboration that went into not only today's webinar, but also all of the resources to come. All this work was made possible by a grant from the USDA Forest Service as part of the Landscape Scale Restoration Grant. Okay, so a few logistics before we get started here. As you already know, the webinar today is being recorded. A link to the recorded presentation will be emailed out to everybody who has registered for the webinar today. And since we are recording this, I ask that you please keep your microphones muted during the presentation. Zoom actually allows you to manage your microphone and your camera throughout the presentation. So just remember that this is being recorded. And if you put your camera on, you will be recorded as well. After the presentation today, we expect to have some time for a Q&A session. And so at this time, we really hope to hear from you. Please use the chat box to share any questions or comments. Or if you are brave and want to use your raised hand tool, you're welcome to ask the question in person. We welcome you to go ahead and unmute yourself at that time and turn your camera on. Okay, so with that, I think we're ready to dive into today's presentation. I think it's safe to say that COVID-19 has impacted all of us in the work that we do, as well as how we do it. SE Group, our presenters today, have really emerged as leaders in community planning, both here in Vermont and across the country. And so I'm so pleased today to be joined by Drew Pollock-Bruce and Julia Randall from SE Group. They'll share their experiences engaging communities virtually, as well as using social distancing tools to help gather input from communities. I first crossed paths with Drew during our Town Forest Recreation project. And so those of you who were involved in that project may recognize him. Drew is really a leader, again, in community and open space planning, again, here in Vermont, as well as nationally, assisting communities in a full range of planning initiatives, really from big to small. Julia, also a member of the SE team, or SE Group team, is a planner and joined SE Group in 2020. Her work centers around developing innovative land use and policy solutions that really reflect the community's values, as well as building resiliency and improving overall quality of life in communities. And so again, I'm really pleased to be joined by them today. And with that, guys, I'll go ahead and hand it over to you.
Thank you so much, Kate. We're really excited to be here today and grateful for the opportunity and excited to share some of our work with you and hear from you all as well. So I'll just begin sharing. Great. So we are going to start this presentation with a bit of online polling. So there are a couple options to join this poll. You can either visit pollev.com/SEgroup538 or text SEgroup538 to the number 22333. And this is an example of some of the live polling software that we use in our community planning and recreation planning projects. And we will show you a bit of the back end of this tool as well, just to show that. Thank you, Kate, for adding that link in the chat. So we'll just give folks a second to join. And I've activated the poll. This is Poll Everywhere. This is an application that we use to get information in real time from participants in a Zoom meeting or Teams meeting or a webinar like this one. And so this tool enables people to respond in real time, and then we'll be able to show the results. So right now we have 0 results, 1 result. Great. Okay, so when we have a couple results here, be able to show those. And I think this group probably knows the answer to this question, if I had to guess. It's a pretty informed group, I would guess. All right, with 6 responses, I'm going to show. All right, and this is a smart group. The answer is C, 1915. So great work. As soon as I can get back to the PowerPoint. All right, thanks everyone for participating in that. So thank you, Kate, for that great introduction. We're just going to introduce ourselves a little bit more and ask all of you today what brings you to this meeting. And you can share in the chat, excuse me for that, what brings you to this call today, and what are some things that you're hoping to learn during this webinar. I'm Julia, I'm a planner at SE Group, as Kate mentioned, and with me on the call today is Drew Pollock-Bruce, who is a senior recreation planner, and we work really closely on several recreation planning projects and community planning projects in a variety of locations. And our firm is pretty multidisciplinary. We do recreation planning and design and community planning, but also landscape architecture and resort planning and a variety of permitting activities. Some projects that we've worked on recently include the Vermont Town Forest Recreation Planning Toolkit, as Kate mentioned, as well as the Kingdom Trails Network Capacity Study, the Missisquoi Valley Rail Trail Project, MRV Moves in the Mad River Valley, trail counting and monitoring projects in Randolph, Vermont, and we're currently working on an outdoor recreation and trails master plan in Grant County, New Mexico. So for a bit of background on the Recreation Planning Toolkit, we created this in 2018. Sorry, this keeps progressing. I don't want it to progress. Great. So this toolkit provided a variety of options for interested community members and land managers, volunteers to gather together and engage in recreation planning for their local town forest. And engagement was a central piece of this toolkit. It's currently available online on the Vermont Community Forestry website, and it'll be linked at the end of this presentation and also in the follow-up documents that we'll provide. Okay, so since March 2020, as Kate mentioned, we have taken our engagement online and experimented with a variety of meeting structures, and including hybrid meeting structures. We've made mistakes in this process and learned from them. And we have successfully launched and completed many different engagement efforts for communities, small and large, and recreation projects, small and large. So one thing that we'd like to note in this presentation about virtual engagement is that virtual engagement is now the norm. So there is more flexibility than ever in terms of the amount of variety of tools that are available to us for virtual engagement. And the barriers to participation in engagement are now lower than ever. It's very easy to log on to a Zoom meeting, and the amount of technology needed to access information and engagement opportunities is lower than ever. And it's also possible for people to attend these meetings at a later time. Recordings are now available. And when people have, extremely pressed schedules, it can be much easier to simply log on to a Zoom meeting or watch a recording as opposed to having to attend an event in person. So one thing that we hope comes across in this presentation is the added flexibility that virtual engagement can add to your project or initiative.
I would just chime in there and add that in general, we have seen greater participation virtually than we had seen previously. We think more folks are becoming familiar with some of these tools, is becoming more of the norm in everyday life. And so that makes public engagement around trails, outdoor recreation, and stewardship and natural spaces. We've been seeing more people coming to our meetings and answering surveys than previously, which has been a great thing.
Thanks, Drew. Yep, and I just want to highlight some of these icons that are on the screen here. Of course, we're all familiar with Zoom, but other forms that are available in terms of virtual engagement include survey software like Google Forms, Poll Everywhere, which we just used, and ArcGIS products. This is the logo for Story Maps, which is the platform that we use for our project websites. And at this time, I just want to check the chat and see who's represented on this call. Thank you all for introducing yourselves. Great. I hope you keep the chat alive throughout this webinar and share your thoughts and questions. And of course, we'll have time for a more focused question section at the end.
And a good practice with virtual meetings like this too is if you can have two facilitators. In this case, Julia is kind of our primary presenter, and that allows me to watch the chat a little bit more closely. And sometimes I'll let Julia know there's a question being asked or things like that. So it can often be helpful to have behind the scenes facilitator and a primary facilitator on calls like that.
Yep. Great. Okay, so we'll have our second poll question now. And this question pertains to the types of virtual engagement tools that you've used. So again, if you could visit pollev.com/SEgroup538 or text SEgroup538 to 22333. And I'm just showing on top of the screen here what this looks like on the back end. So what I did is I hit this button here to activate this question. And now, great, we have some responses already, 9 responses. Because this is a select all that apply question, there'll be more results. So I'm gonna wait a little bit longer to check. Okay, great. Okay, so in terms of the types of engagement tools that folks have used, online surveys are quite popular, live polling, project websites, interactive maps. And then these events like virtual open houses and virtual walking tours, which are maybe a bit more involved than an online survey, are showing as a bit less popular. Great. This is really interesting to see on our side. Isn't it true?
I answered them too, though, so that may.
Oh, okay.
But Kate is asking if there's a fee for this polling system.
Yes, there is. This is a subscription-based service, so there is a fee. Although there are different tiers, so some of it is quite accessible.
We like it too because you can use it in an in-person format as well with the cell phones. So that can be helpful too with in-person presentations. I see Pamela mentioned it can be tough to use a browser while being in Zoom. And so that is absolutely true, especially if you have one screen. And so you can use your phone. And a lot of times too, and Julia will show off a couple other tools you can use right in Zoom, or use a chat as well. And those are free.
Zoom does have polling as well, which can be useful. We find that the display is a bit better in Poll Everywhere, which can be useful when trying to capture some of these engagement activities for use in a later report. So that streamlines that step. But thanks for that feedback. All right. So let's take a step back for a second and ask, what is engagement exactly? What is it that we're trying to accomplish in person, and what would that look like online? So engagement is a variety of things. Some ideas that we've come up with here are that engagement is an invitation to share priorities and concerns and experiences. It's a chance for community members to get together and share those things. It's also a way to build trust between decision makers and members of the public and influence that decision making. And it also is a crucial ingredient for the success of eventual project outcomes. So please add anything that we missed in terms of what engagement means to you in the chat. Community conversations.
I would just add, while people think there too, my biggest finding is the conversations that people have together in even a focus group or an online setting can be really helpful. Often they meet each other and find other interested people in their community, maybe they haven't met before, which is always really helpful.
Yep. Okay, so we have buy-in, ownership in the initiative, surfacing and discovering different perspectives, people showing up to a meeting or an event, assessing knowledge or learning. Great.
Yeah, and that's super helpful. A lot of groups have been using the polling options in Facebook with really good results. And that's free and already often engaging with members or people who are following those accounts. Really helpful.
Yeah. So the last thing I've just seen in the chat is empowering the community, and that brings us really nicely into this next slide about the ladder of citizen participation. This is a concept that's common in planning theory, and it describes the degree of control that citizens can have on initiatives in their community. And so at the top here, citizen control is direct control of things happening in a community. And at the bottom is manipulation. So the goal of engagement efforts is to move up this ladder and provide power and influence opportunities for citizens to influence outcomes in their community. So community engagement tends to sit in this 6 to 7 category of partnership and delegated power. So it's because this is an invitation to hear from community members and assess their agreement with some of the ideas being presented and their desires for envisioning for the future of their community or town forest, as it may be. This is a chance for them to directly contribute to those ideas. So what does engagement look like in a more general sense? To talk about this and demonstrate this before we talk about translating engagement into a virtual setting, we'll talk about what engagement looks like in a more traditional sense. And I'll turn it over to Drew to talk about the Town Forest Recreation Planning Toolkit for a moment.
And we'll just use this as an example of a community planning process to see how engagement fits into that.
Yeah.
And as we had mentioned, the Recreation Planning Toolkit did support everything you need to do to conduct a planning process within a town forest. It is focused on recreation activities, but could be modified to talk about stewardship, management, any kind of things happening within open spaces and town forests. But it's primarily focused on recreation planning. As you mentioned, we worked with 10 different communities throughout Vermont to do that, to build that toolkit, and so implemented that process using that toolkit and use that to refine the final products. I know some folks on the call are familiar with some of these places or have been involved. I know too, for example, Darren in Essex, we did a project together that also implemented this toolkit for Saxon Hill Town Forest there, but was not part of the pilot communities. It was kind of one of the best years of my life visiting all of these 10 forests and 10 communities. We did site visits and got to go to all of them. There we were exploring opportunities and constraints, looking at opportunities for historical interpretation, for renovation, for trail improvements, for example. And these are just some really fun stats throughout the project. There was over 50 steering committee meetings in the 10 towns. Got to walk over 50 miles in town forest. I think Kate and I were both feeling very fit probably at the end of that. We received over 1,200 survey responses. Hosted over 650 folks at our public meetings for all the different projects in the 10 towns. Used 6,500 sticker dots.
That's the stat that surprises me the most.
It is a lot. There were a lot of boards being asked, and we ate a lot of great snacks. The one in Bradford, especially, the public meeting was in a restaurant downtown there. It's just incredible food, so we got to eat well during this process. It's always really important to help feed people when they come out to public meetings. It helps get people out. Unfortunately for me, we did have to drive all over the state, so we did spend a lot of miles in the car, but it was for a good cause. And thankfully, most of those trips were with a Vermont car share, so pretty efficient vehicle. And then this just looks at the planning process here. And each of the green boxes shows the community input throughout the process. And that really helps drive all of the other tasks. And so we start out in the visioning phase with kind of 3 different opportunities for visioning with the public at an open house workshop, through a community survey, and then with the town forest committee or the steering committee. That first phase is really about listening. And so there's very little presentations, and it's very much about hearing from the community and from the committee. And then as you hear those things, you are able to develop a framework that encapsulates the feedback that you've heard. And that allows you to then act upon that input that you've got, to think about what are the range of strategies that could help achieve what people are interested in. And then that gives us to another opportunity for community input, where they make sure and verify that the encapsulation of that vision was correct, and helping to dial that in, as well as prioritizing and thinking about strategies to achieve that vision. And the final element of public engagement in that process too is then presenting the preferred and prioritized strategies, and making sure that was captured correctly, and checking in with the community before you move in towards kind of the end of a project where you're then transitioning towards implementation, and keeping that public engagement going throughout the process and even after it ends can be really important. I know, for example, Liza has some familiarity with this in the Mad River Valley and some projects that we worked on together where you have a discrete project, but then that out of that comes a whole new process of engagement, and you kind of build up that framework as you move along. And so the idea is by the time you get to implementation, all of the connections and relationships that you've built up throughout the project can then help carry things forward. And I'll turn it back over to you.
Great. So we learned a few things from this town forest recreation planning process that I think are valuable to carry through into future engagement opportunities related to stewardship in town forests. So stewardship was a high value, and conservation is a high value for participants in these workshops, which were related to recreation planning. So I think that's important to keep in mind in future workshops and engagement efforts. These are some of the key values that people noted about their town forest, and this applied to all of the 10 communities. And stewardship came up as a top priority here, a healthy balance between stewardship and human uses, wildlife and habitat, sustainable trail system, trees and plant species, solitude, year-round recreation, outdoor education and research, sense of place, forestry and forest products, economic development, connection to nature, and accessible and inclusive. So these are some values that are a great starting place for some of these future engagement efforts. It's great to build on what's already known and reassess. So these key values, which will include in your copy of the presentation that will be distributed after this webinar, might be a good starting place for some of these future engagement efforts. Asking questions like, does this list still resonate with you, might be a good starting place. So there's some common themes and lessons learned across these communities, town forest communities. Regardless of the size or stage of management of the town forest, they're experiencing similar management issues and central questions about how to proceed with the different uses and desires that the community has for their town forest. Recreation and the concept of it is very varied across these town forests. The spectrum of uses in one forest could be very different from another. This third bullet is important to know for this group. Planning is never done, and I would add that engagement is also never done. And a continued dialogue is needed to ensure that the management solutions and future planning are in alignment with both the desires for that area and also the resource management needs for that area. And then, of course, capacity is a common theme across all of these natural town forests and also natural areas throughout Vermont. The biggest takeaway that we have from this process is that the values for these relatively small areas are diverse and complex. Many different stakeholders are involved in the care and use and enjoyment of these town forests. And there are many different considerations that must go into planning efforts, whether they be for recreation, stewardship, or other management activities. So public land managers, the managers of national forests, national parks, state parks, have an established team and processes and lots of resources. Town forests are managed by teams of dedicated and passionate volunteers. So there's additional support needed to ensure that these places have the resources and sufficient planning to thrive and serve their broader community. So the need is great, and there's a lot of work to do, and I think that's where this group comes in. So this brings us to today. How can we apply what we've learned from the recreation toolkit, and also what we've learned during our experiences on Zoom, with Zoom fatigue over these past 2 years to engage communities virtually on stewardship initiatives and issues. So let's start with the recreation framework. This public engagement pod is a portion of the recreation planning toolkit that's available on the Town Forest website, the Community Forestry website. And as Drew mentioned, there were several pods as a part of this toolkit, including a plan document pod, a visioning pod. This is the public engagement pod. So it's all things public engagement from start to finish. And these headings here: a steering committee, a public visioning workshop, a community survey, a strategies workshop, a draft plan, community presentation. These are all things that are available and at your disposal for creating a longer term engagement strategy, whether it be related to recreation or stewardship. So the tools that are currently available on the website as part of the toolkit are centered around recreation, but of course, recreation and stewardship conversations go hand in hand. And these tools are highly applicable to stewardship conversations as well. And since we're talking about the same types of areas, geographic areas, these town forests, they're already tailor-made for the scale of the issues that need to be discussed. So this is a link right here to the toolkit, and we'll also provide it in a separate sheet in the email that's going to go out to every participant and those who signed up following this meeting. So this flyer is an example of some of the tools that are available and templates that are available to you in the recreation planning toolkit. So it's possible to download this and use a tool like Adobe or PowerPoint to adjust this as you see fit for your project, or even just as an idea for a simple design that includes a clear title for your event, a clear ask that involves the public and emphasizes their role in creating a future for their town forest, and of course meeting details. And so in our email to you after this meeting, we'll be providing a summary of this presentation, as well as some nuts and bolts to some links to both this toolkit, links to a variety of survey tools that we use, and some that are free and some that do involve payment, and then also different platforms for project websites, the basics of setting up a QR code for a survey or project website and displaying that at your local town forest at a trailhead, for example, and the basics of interactive mapping. So just returning to these community values, these are things that can be explored through a variety of meeting structures or engagement formats. So these things can be a great place to start for surveying, but it can also be a great thing to lead with on your project website noting that water and aesthetics and spiritual values are things that guide your initiative from the start. So we'll now move into just some practical tools and tips that have been helpful to us and that we have learned over the past few years conducting some of these virtual engagements. So the first tip is a rather simple one. The notion that effective virtual engagement and effective engagement can look quite similar. It's about the same things, reaching the most people and including the relevant groups, user groups, for example. It's about presenting ideas and soliciting input and providing a forum and a collaborative environment for these conversations to occur. And importantly, engagement is something that sets the stage for future community investment and implementation. It's an invitation to be involved not only in one meeting, but in all the future meetings and discussions long into the future. So the second tip in terms of virtual engagement is that online tools can really help with this streamlining, can help streamline the processing of data and information. So for example, this is an example of the Poll Everywhere tool and the usefulness of that platform for future presentations and communication of community priorities. Zoom polling can also be really effective for this. Of course, with the endless online conversations about planning projects and design projects, it is easier than ever to see what people are saying directly about your project. So this is useful. You might see the things that people might not say during a public meeting, but it's still information that you can understand about your project and its role in the community. The other segment about this tip is to know your stakeholders. It's easier than ever to stay in touch with the people who are interested in being involved in your plan or initiative. And email communications are the best way that we have found to do this. Rather than simply updating a project website, it's also helpful to directly send out an email to the interested parties in your group, letting them know about future communications and opportunities to get involved. So the third tip is that accessibility and inclusion is a recipe for good engagement. So what this looks like in a virtual setting is providing different tools for different types of participants. Many people are afraid of public speaking, and so tools like the chat in Zoom and also providing a form on project websites can be really helpful for enabling people to share their thoughts without having to make them feel anxious about having to speak in front of a group. The chat is especially useful for quick feedback on an idea in real time. The other consideration in terms of accessibility here is to define terms. So especially in a Zoom environment when these meetings are more accessible than ever, it is possible that not all participants are arriving at the meeting with the same level of context or knowledge of some of the terms that you may be using, particularly when that relate to ecology or other highly complex topics. So it's important to define those terms to make sure that everyone is on the same page and can participate in the conversation equally. So providing and highlighting accommodations is also a best practice in terms of accessibility and inclusion. Things like large text or the ability to zoom in is also a great standard practice. And then using the tools that people are most familiar with is also a good practice for accessibility and inclusion. So people are most familiar with Zoom. Our organization uses Microsoft Teams for our own internal meetings, and we have found that holding meetings on Zoom can increase the level of comfort that people have on a particular meeting, and also just the general ability of people to join a meeting quickly and without confusion. So this next tip is that place-based engagement is still possible in a virtual setting. Let me go back there. The idea of meeting people where they're at is a common phrase in engagement, and this still applies in a virtual setting. So whether that be front porch forum or social media accounts that are popular in your area, there are still places and ways to advertise your project or initiative where people are already visiting. It's much easier to intercept people in places or in methods that they are already engaging with. The second point here is to provide materials at your town forest or other relevant location. And this ensures that you are reaching the people who care, are likely to care the most about your project, current users of those town forests. So this can look like a QR code to a survey. It could look like a self-guided walking tour that includes some of those interactive elements, or input stations like the one shown here. This is in Northfield for a Rivers to Roots project. And then another option in terms of a place-based solution is a virtual place, providing an online map that has a comment feature is another great way of soliciting input that is location-based. This next tip is to keep the purpose in mind. So this technology is really great, right? It's really, flashy and new, but it should always come secondary to, the real purpose of your meeting. The technology is the how, but the other more important considerations are why this engagement needs to occur, what questions need to be asked, and what should be shared, and who do you need to see there. So nuts and bolts of meetings are super important. This is the stuff that is, not as flashy, but definitely important to keep in mind. Things like reminder emails, providing a centralized location for engagement information like a project website or a landing page can be really important for boosting that participation. Things like breakout groups that encourage smaller discussions can be really useful for gathering feedback and encouraging folks to share, because the flip side of having meeting recordings and surveys and all these other tools that make the engagement more accessible is you do lose a bit of the organic and more detailed feedback that you can get when people are just speaking in a group about their experiences and priorities. Providing different options, including call-in options, is also a best practice in terms of the nuts and bolts of these virtual meetings.
I'll just chime in there really quickly with an experience that we've had. We referenced the Kingdom Trails project a little bit earlier up in the Northeast Kingdom. And that was right at the height of COVID, in 2020, early summer, late spring. So right when we were all figuring that out. And as we know, the Northeast Kingdom doesn't have great internet service. And we still had really good participation, but we had to offer the call-in options. We would even mail a hard copy mail version of the presentation and the questions that were being asked to folks as well beforehand. And that really helped support those different options, particularly in some of the smaller communities in Vermont, or where people might not be as familiar even still with Zoom and things like that. we still are able to get good participation, but you just might have to send things ahead of time, for example, or make it a little bit easier to call in.
Thanks, Drew. Okay, so now we will just provide an example of an interesting tool that you can use in Zoom to gather feedback in real time. So if those instructions are clear to everyone, you can click the View Options button on the top of your screen and select the Annotate function. Oh, great. Okay, people are doing it. Thank you, Darren. Darren's figured it out. Awesome. I love these shapes. These are great. This is beautiful. We can sell this.
I have
Awesome.
to admit, Julia, I need help. Tell me more. Where do I
Okay.
find this?
Okay, if you go to
If-
the View Options button, it'll be right next to that green bar where it says you are viewing my screen.
It may not show up until you scroll all the way up to the top, and it may show up as a floating.
I didn't know we had a bunch of artists on this call. This is cool.
Is everyone able to find it?
Very good. Okay, so we'll move to the next exercise where we'll be able to use this for an engagement setting. Great. So there's an opportunity here to answer a question in real time using this Annotate function. So you have 3 stars to use on improving your town forest stewardship management and programming. Where will you spend them? So there are a couple options here. One is to use the text annotation tool to write in an other option. Yep, you can also circle on this slide. Great.
Or you can use the stamp too to do a star.
Yeah, Ginger just used a stamp.
I was just trying to write, just found it. Thank you, Darren. This is great.
Great.
One of the challenges with having multiple screens open in Zoom,
Yes.
right, is being able to find all these tools. But I'm super excited that everybody was able to find it, and thanks for putting this out.
So Darren just asked, as an admin, do you have to turn on the annotate option for participants? Yes, this is a setting that you have in Zoom, and the default is to have it on. So I would just check that that is on. And it is available in both the meeting, general, like a traditional meeting format for Zoom, and also these Zoom webinars. So yeah, and it's possible to, if you're an administrator and you'd like to disable the annotation, it's also possible to do that either before a Zoom meeting or during the meeting. Okay, but I love these responses. Okay, so monitoring is ranking highly, so is trail maintenance. Great. Interpretation. That looks like a trail sign. I don't know if that was intentional.
That's an arrow.
Yeah. Awesome. Great work, everyone. All right, I'm gonna definitely take a picture of this and share it with the group later as part of this PowerPoint.
It's okay to spend more stars here, Pamela.
Yes, you don't have to limit yourself to 3 in this fictional exercise.
But we do like to use that tool to ask people about how they prioritize different activities, by limiting the number of stars or the number of town forest dollars you might give to people. And if we do this in person, sometimes these things are just jars, mason jars, and we give each people Monopoly money to put into the jars.
Yep, Monopoly money, or they're like pictures of jars and they can add sticker dots. So this is a pretty good example of, something that translates pretty identically onto a virtual environment. Great. So finally, we will just show some engagement outcomes and talk about just what the final result of this can look like. So the final result is you've heard the community, you're protecting the forest resource, and you are effectively managing forests for the resources that you and your community value. So it's just important to keep that finish line in mind, especially when there's a particularly challenging moment in engagement, whether that's low turnout at an event or conflicting responses in a survey or from a public meeting. It's important to keep this outcome in mind as the eventual goal. Great. So with that, we will turn it over to you all for some questions. I'll scroll back in the chat too to see if there were any questions in there. Thank you all so much.
Great. Thank you, Julia and Drew. Thank you so much for sharing such great information and an overview of the tips and your techniques of having used online and socially distanced community engagement. It's really interesting to hear sort of the different types of ways that you guys have used. And I have to say, my favorite though is that Annotate with Zoom. What a cool tool, and it's right at our fingertips that we didn't even know about. I'm curious, and I'd love to encourage folks to enter any questions into the chat box. As we're waiting for folks, though, one of the things you struck me, Julia, when you were talking, it hit me that, given sort of here we are coming out of COVID, right? And, I think that there is sort of a desire for folks to go back in person. Talk to us a little bit about kind of how you make the decision about, sort of using a virtual tool versus a, more in-person type of community engagement event or process. You mentioned the workshops, the visioning workshops that we did as part of the town forest recreation planning process. I'd love to hear a little bit more from you guys about how you make that decision and maybe what are the things that you're considering, or you have considered, as you've worked with communities around the state in encouraging them to go one way or the other or to do a hybrid.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think several things go into that decision. I think weather in Vermont is critical. It's much easier to have an in-person event if that is the direction that you decide to go in the summer months when people can distance effectively. But in terms of deciding whether to have an in-person or virtual event, just more generally, I think, there are some platforms that have always been better suited to being online, like things like surveys that streamline the process of asking and then collecting and analyzing information. So, the engagement and the, nothing can replace the value of a person-to-person in-person conversation and, that type of interaction that can happen at a thing like an open house or community visioning event. That's really useful. But there are certainly some avenues that are much better suited to virtual engagement. Things that relate to data collection certainly are one of those things.
I think too, I would just add in a note that it's almost not a choice now, like where people expect digital. If you have an in-person option, we're finding that folks want some option to also provide digital input. And so it's kind of like, the resources that exist for a project are what they are, but we would highly encourage to try to offer both, and almost, if you're going to do in person, to also offer a digital option. And we're having a meeting tonight at Leddy Park in Burlington, and that's one of their first in-person public meetings for parks and open spaces since COVID. It will be outdoors under a tent, and The weather seems like it's going to hold off today until at least after our meeting. We end at 6:30. But being able to be outdoors can help with that decision making, I think. I see we had a question from Darren around how to manage public input that is disruptive, toxic, or otherwise not productive to the conversation, particularly outside of live meetings. I think part of the platform in which you provide to folks can help with that. Not giving a soapbox, for example, at a live meeting can help with that. Setting some expectations and norms. And I'll just share my screen if I can for just one moment. These are just an example of some of the meeting norms that we used. This was for an ATV master plan in Minnesota. There are obviously some very passionate people on both sides of that topic. And so we really kind of started out with these expectations with everybody as we started that engagement. And this was a focus group, but you could have similar expectations on a forum or something that's not live where they're commenting back to each other. Surveys too are helpful to folks aren't arguing with each other when they're individually answering surveys. And then one final note on that too is that we almost always hear from people who maybe are on one side or the other of an argument. We like to think we often hear about from 30% of the perspectives, 15% pro or 15% opposed, but we often don't hear, we feel, from the middle, 70% who are somewhat agnostic or aren't as passionate. And so as planners, it's part of our job to know that we're not hearing from every perspective in the community and trying to contextualize what we're hearing with what we know about what we're not hearing as well. Feel free to add to that as well.
Yeah. I just want to move to the next question because I see that we have just 1 minute left. I'm curious if you think that moving to a digital platform has led either to more people participating in sessions or different people than those who might have participated in sessions in person. And if so, who those people might have been. Yeah, that's a great question. And I, love to hear you add to this, Drew, but I do think, we've seen more participation overall, certainly. And the people who are able to participate in online sessions are often younger or people with families who have significant constraints on their time in the evenings and might find it difficult to make an evening meeting in person otherwise. So those are some groups that I have observed more participation in.
Yeah, I think that's spot on. We have absolutely seen more participation actually in the digital era, which was a surprising finding, I think, for many of the planners. We thought, do people have time to make time, in their daily lives for these digital engagements? And we find that they are finding the time, actually. I think I saw Ginger added a note too for Darren. I think that's spot on too around multiple hosts helping to address some of those folks that could be disruptive.
Absolutely, and thank you so much, Ginger, for sharing that experience. And thank you again. I just want to just take a minute and thank our presenters today. Thank you for joining us, sharing your experience, your expertise, and also thank you for modeling. How interactive the online platform can really be when we're having conversations, both in terms of education, but also some of these larger conversations about planning in the community. So I just wanted to, I know we're at time, and unfortunately, I know some folks have to jump off right at 1, but I wanted to just acknowledge and share, remind folks that this is the second of a 3-part webinar series. And so just a quick reminder that we have 3 more webinars to come. So I'm going to shamelessly put in a plug for those sessions. You can see them here, hopefully, as part of my screen share. And so next week, we'll be talking about governance, which I think feeds right into, sort of these conversations around community engagement, sort of how do we organize ourselves around decision making. So with that, again, thank you so much to Drew and Julia for joining us today and sharing these tips and ideas around online engagement. Clearly it's here to stay. And I feel like, you know, all of us sharing kind of what we know is super helpful to making it a successful platform moving forward. So again, thank you guys.
Yeah, thank you so much. We put our emails in the chat if you ever want to reach out and ask us anything about public engagement or just get some tips or strategy, please do. Thank you so much.
Awesome. Thank you
very
guys
much.
again.